Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Poor Peter has been so lonely and disgruntled and, most of all, jealous this whole summer. Instead of having Heidi to himself up on the mountain pasture, she has been spending all her time with Clara. And even when she decides to come up to the high meadows with him, she will be bringing her friend. When Peter sees an opportunity to force Clara to go home immediately, he takes it. But the action brings unexpected consequences for everyone. Here is the thrilling conclusion of the wonderful story of Heidi. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 22. The Unexpected Happens. Very early the next morning, Nuncle came out of the hut and looked about him to see what the weather was going to be. On the high mountain peaks rested a ruddy golden light. A cool wind was beginning to stir the branches of the pine trees. The sun was about to rise. For a while the old man stood and watched with earnest attention, as first the lofty summits, and then the green hills, caught the golden gleam. Then the dark shadows rolled softly back from the valley, and a rosy light streamed into it, until suddenly heights and depths alike were bathed in the full glory of day. The sun had risen. Nuncle brought the wheelchair out of the shop, put it in front of the hut, so that it would be ready for the journey, and then entered the house to tell the children how fine the morning was, and that it was time to get up. Just then, Peter came climbing up the path. His goats did not follow him so trustingly as usual this time, nor were they so close behind, beside, or yet before him. They kept darting away from him in one direction or another, because he was striking at them without any excuse whatever, like a madman. And when he hit anywhere, it hurt badly. Poor Peter had reached the depths of vexation and bitterness. For weeks he had not had Heidi all alone to himself as he once had. By the time he arrived in the morning, the strange child had always been carried out in her chair, and Heidi was paying attention to her. When he came down again in the evening, the wheelchair with its occupant was still standing under the fir trees, and Heidi was busied with her guest. She had not gone up to the pasture the whole summer long, and now today she was planning to go, but with the wheelchair and the strange girl in it, and she would give up all her time to her. Peter could see how it would turn out, and this is what had brought his secret rage to the boiling point. His eye now lighted on the chair as it stood there so proudly on its rollers, and he frowned at it, as if it were an enemy that had already done him all kinds of harm, and was plotting new mischief for today. He looked quickly about him. Everything was quiet. There was not a single person in sight. Then, like a savage, he rushed at the chair, grasped it with his hands, and gave it such a violent shove toward the slope of the mountain that the chair fairly flew away from his angry clutch, and immediately disappeared over the edge of the cliff. Now he had done it. As if borne along on wings, Peter rushed off up the mountain meadow, and never once stopped for breath until he had reached a great blackberry bush, behind which he could hide. For he did not in the least wish to have Nuncle spy him, but he did wish to see what became of the chair, and the bush on the spur of the mountain was well situated for this purpose. Peter himself, half hidden, could look down on the meadow and still be able to duck out of sight in a hurry if Nuncle should appear. He peered down from his hiding place, and what a sight met his eyes! Far beneath him his enemy was rushing to destruction, constantly driven on by stronger forces. It turned one somersault after another. It sprang high into the air and crashed down to earth again. It rolled over and over as it hurried on to ruin. Parts of it were already flying in all directions. Its legs, its back, its padded cushions were flying through the air. Peter was unable to restrain his joy at this glorious sight, and he clicked his heels together and jumped as high as he could. He laughed aloud. He stamped his feet blissfully. He danced around in circles. But he always returned to the same spot to take a new look down the slope. And then he had to laugh afresh and dance anew for joy. Peter was fairly out of his head with delight at the destruction of his enemy, for he felt sure that only good would come of it. Now, he was certain, the strange girl would have to go away, for she would have no means of getting from one place to another. Heidi would be left alone again, and would come to the pasture with him. She would be on the lookout for him morning and evening when he came along, and everything would again be just as it used to be. But Peter had not yet had time to consider what happens to one who has done a wicked deed, nor had he thought of the consequences that follow. Heidi was the first to come out of the hut and run to the shop. Behind her came Grandfather, with Clara in his arms. The door of the shop stood wide open. Both boards had been laid aside, and it was as light as day in the farthest corner. Heidi peered all about the shop, then darted around the corner of it, and then returned with a look of great amazement on her face. Just then Grandfather came up. "What's up?" he asked. "Did you wheel the chair away?" "Why, I'm looking for it everywhere, Grandfather," the child answered, still keeping up her search. "You told me it was standing beside the door of the shop." Meanwhile, the wind had increased in force. It was making the door rattle, and just at that moment slammed it back with a crash against the wall of the shop. Why, Grandfather, the wind did it!" cried Heidi, and her eyes blazed at the thought. "Oh, if the old chair's been blown down into Dörfli, it will be a long time before we can get it back, and then too late for us to go at all." "If it has rolled down there, it will never come back," said Grandfather, as he walked around the shop and looked down the mountain, "for it will be in 100 pieces. But it's funny how it happened," he continued, looking back at the course the chair must have taken around the edge of the hut in order to get started downhill. "Oh, what a shame!" Clara wailed. "Now we can't go at all, and perhaps we never can. Oh, I'll have to go home if I haven't any chair. It's just too bad." But Heidi looked up at her grandfather trustfully. "Grandfather, you'll find some way so it won't be as bad as Clara thinks, won't you?" she asked. "And so she won't even have to go home." "This once we'll go up to the pasture, just as we decided to," the old man said. "Afterward, we'll see what can be done." The children shouted for joy. He went back into the hut, brought out a large share of all the shawls, laid them beside the cottage in the sunniest spot that he could find, and set Clara down on them. Then he fetched the morning's milk for the children, and led Schweinli and Barely out in front of the shed. "I wonder why that rascal is such a long time coming up," Nuncle said to himself, for Peter's signaling whistle had not yet sounded. Then he took Clara up on one arm and the shawls on the other. "Well, let's start," he said. "The goats can come with us." That arrangement just suited Heidi. With one arm around little Swan's neck and the other around little Bear's, she strolled along beside her grandfather. And the goats were so overjoyed to be with Heidi again that between them they almost squeezed her to pieces as proof of their affection. When they had got up to the pasture grounds, all at once they saw the goats standing around in small groups here and there on the slopes, peacefully grazing, while Peter in their midst was stretched out full length upon the ground. "Next time you pass us by, I'll attend to you, you booby," Nuncle hailed him.
"What did you mean by that?"
"Nobody was up yet," Peter answered. At the sound of that well-known voice, he had jumped up in a hurry.
"Did you see any signs of a chair?" Nuncle asked again.
"Of what?" Peter called back surlily. Nuncle said nothing further. He spread his shawls on the sunny slope, set Clara down on them, and asked her if she was comfortable. "Just as cozy as I'd be in my chair," she said gratefully. "And here I am in the nicest place in the world. Oh, Heidi, it is so beautiful here," she cried, as she drank in the splendor of the view unrolled before her. Grandfather was now ready to go back. He told them to have a good time together, and when it was noon, then Heidi could get out their dinner, which was packed in the bag he had left over in the shade. Peter would get their milk when they wanted it, as much as they could drink, but Heidi must remember to see that it came from Schweinli. Grandfather promised to come back at dusk. He was now going to see what had become of the chair. The sky was deep blue, and whichever way you looked, not a single cloud was to be seen in it anywhere. The great glacier across from them sparkled as if with the light of countless thousands of gold and silver stars. The grim horns of the cliffs, tall and massive, stood in the place that had been theirs through the ages, and gazed solemnly down into the valley. The big bird of prey swept high above them in the haze, and the breeze from the mountains came across the heights and refreshed the sunlit summits with its cool breath. The children were as happy as they could be. From time to time, a little goat would come to lie down beside them for a while. Soft-hearted Schneehöppli was one of their most frequent visitors. She would rest her small head on Heidi's lap and stay in that position until some one of her fellows came to drive her away. Clara thus learned to know the goats so well that she could tell them apart quite easily, for she saw that each face differed from the others, and each animal had its own peculiar ways. They soon felt that they could trust in Clara, and so they would come up close and rub their heads against her shoulder, which was an unfailing sign of friendship and affection. Several hours sped by in this fashion, and then Heidi decided that she would like to go over to the place where all the flowers were, just to see if they were open still, and as lovely as they had been the year before. Of course, she knew that when evening came and Grandfather was back, they could take Clara with them, but by that time, perhaps the flowers would have closed their eyes. Heidi's longing grew until she could no longer resist it. A little timidly, she asked, "Would you mind so very much, Clara, if I should run away for just a twinkling and leave you all alone? I'm so anxious to see how the flowers are getting along, but wait!" Heidi had a sudden thought. She darted off a little way and pulled up a few fine bunches of green plants. The moment Schneehöppli saw this, she came running toward Heidi, and the child put her arms around the goat's neck and brought her to Clara. "There! Now you won't be left alone after all," she said, and she pushed Schneehöppli up a little closer to Clara. The goat seemed to know what was wanted and lay down. Then Heidi threw the green stuff she had gathered into Clara's lap, and the invalid said very happily that Heidi could now go and have a good look at the flowers, as she was glad to be left alone with the goat. That would be quite a new experience for her. So Heidi ran off on her errand, and Clara began to hold out her plants to Schneehöppli, a leaf or two at a time. And the young goat was so trustful that she nestled close to her new friend and slowly nibbled at the leaves in her hand. It was plain to be seen how contented she was, for she gave herself up quietly and peacefully to Clara's care. When she was with the herd, and no one came to her rescue, she always had to suffer from the attacks of the larger and stronger goats. It seemed wonderfully good to Clara to be able to sit this way off on a mountain, all alone except for the little tame goat that looked up at her so helplessly. She felt a great desire to be her own master, and now and then to be able to help someone else, instead of always having to rely upon the services of others. Many thoughts which she had never had before came flooding into Clara's mind, and with them a new desire to go on living in this world full of beautiful sunshine, and to do things that would make others happy, just as she was now gladdening Schneehöppli. A strange joy entered her heart, and it suddenly seemed to her as if all the things she had ever known might be more beautiful and different from what she had expected. And in her newly won feeling of happiness, she was so contented that she threw her arms around the little goat's neck and cried, "Oh, little snowhopper, how lovely it is up here! If I just never had to leave you again." Meanwhile, Heidi had reached the spot where the flowers bloomed. She cried out with joy. The whole mountainside lay covered with shining gold. There were the gleaming rock roses. Thick purplish clusters of bluebells were swaying in the gentle breeze. A strong spicy smell enveloped the sunlit slope, as if most precious cups of balsam had been poured out upon the ground. All this sweet odor, however, came from the small brown mace flowers that reared their round tops shyly from among the yellow trefoil. Heidi stood still and gazed, drinking in deep draughts of the sweet air. Suddenly she turned and ran back to Clara, all out of breath with excitement. "Oh, you've got to come," she called, even before she reached Clara's side. "They are so lovely, and everything there is so beautiful. And perhaps it won't be that way hours from now. Don't you think perhaps I might carry you?" Clara looked at her excited friend with no little surprise, but she shook her head. "What are you thinking of, Heidi? Of course you couldn't. Why, you're a lot smaller than I am. But I do wish I could go." Then Heidi looked around on every side, trying to find some way out of their difficulty. And a new plan was slowly forming in her determined young mind. There above the children, where he had been stretched out at full length on the grass, sat Mr. Peter, staring down at them. He had been sitting that way for hours, gazing fixedly at them, as if he could not understand what he saw. Had he not destroyed the hateful old wheelchair to make an end of the strange guest and to keep her from going anywhere at all? And yet, only a short time after he had sent the chair off down the slope, she had appeared up there and was perched beside Heidi right in front of him. It couldn't have happened, and still it was true all right, for there she was whenever he cared to look at her. And now he saw Heidi's eyes upturned to him. "Come down a minute, Peter," she called very firmly. "Won't do it," he yelled back. "You will too, you have to," Heidi said threateningly. "Come ahead. I can't do it alone, and you've got to help. Hurry up." "Won't either," was the surly answer. Then Heidi ran a little way up the mountain toward Peter, and confronted him with her eyes aflame. She cried, "If you don't come here to me this minute, you Peter, I'll do something to you that you won't like at all. You just see if I don't." These words made Peter tremble, and he was seized with a great fear. He had done a wicked deed, which must be kept secret at all cost. Until this very minute, the thought of his naughty act had made him very happy. But now Heidi was talking as if she knew all about it, and was going to tell her grandfather on him. And Peter was more afraid of that old man than anyone else alive. Suppose he found out what had happened to the chair? Peter's blood ran cold to think of it. He got up and went to meet Heidi. "I'm coming, but then you must promise not to do it," he said. And his fright made him so tame that Heidi felt quite sorry for him. "All right, then, I won't do it now," she assured him. "You come with me. There's nothing to make you afraid in what I want of you." When they got to Clara, Heidi showed what was to be done. Peter was to take hold of Clara by one arm, Heidi by the other, and lift her to her feet. And they did that all right, but then came the hardest thing. The invalid, of course, could not stand by herself, and how were they going to hold her so that she could walk along? Heidi was too short to support the sick girl on her arm. "You must put your arm very firmly around my neck, Clara, like that. And you must take Peter's arm and lean on it hard. Then we can move you along." The young goatherd had never given any girl his arm before. Clara took hold of it properly, but he let it hang stiffly down by his side, like a long pole. "Oh, that's not the way, Peter," Heidi said disgustedly. "You must make a circle of your arm, and then she can put her hand through it and press as hard as she wants to. Whatever you do, don't let go. And then we're all ready for the march." This plan was tried, but nothing much came of it. Clara was fairly heavy, and the team of helpers was too unlike in size. She had to reach up on one side and down on the other, and that made her support very uncertain. Clara tried to advance first one foot and then the other, but found she could not bear her weight on either, and so drew them painfully back again. "Just plant them right down hard," Heidi suggested, "and then you'll find it won't hurt so much." "Do you think so?" Clara asked timidly. But she did as she was told and tried to take a couple of steps along the ground. This made her cry out with pain. After a moment, she raised a foot and set it down again more gently. "Why, that didn't hurt half so badly," she said merrily. "Try it once more," Heidi urged eagerly. Clara obeyed. Then she tried her foot several times, and suddenly she screamed, "Oh, Heidi, look at me! I can do it! I can take one step right after another." Then Heidi started to shout much more loudly than her friend. "Honest? True? Really, you can take steps like that? Why, you can! You're walking all by yourself. You're walking. If Grandfather could only see you." It seemed as if there was no end to Heidi's great joy. To be sure, Clara was leaning hard on both of them, but with each step she took, she gained a little more confidence. There was no question about it. Heidi was almost bursting with delight. "Oh, now we can go to the pasture together every day," she exclaimed, "and walk wherever we want to on the mountain, and all the rest of your life you can go around like me, and be strong, and never be shoved in a chair again. Oh, isn't that the very nicest thing that could have happened to us?" Clara said yes to that with her whole heart. Surely she knew no greater piece of luck in all the world than to be healthy and walk about like other people, and not be condemned to spend her days miserably in an invalid's chair. The slope where the flowers bloomed was not far away. They could see the gold roses gleaming in the sunlight. Then they came to the tufts of bluebells, where the sunny earth showed through so invitingly. "Can't we sit down here?" Clara asked. That was just what Heidi wanted to do. So the children settled down among the flowers, and Clara was more happy than you would ever guess, for this was the first time that she had ever sat on the bare ground, and she found it warm and dry. All about her she saw the waving tops of the bluebells, the glinting gold roses, the red centauries, and everywhere was the sweet odor of the brown mace flowers and spicy prunellas. It was lovely beyond words. Heidi, too, who was seated beside her, felt that it had never before been quite so beautiful up there, and she really could not herself have told why there was so fierce a joy in her heart that she wanted to cry it aloud to the sky. And then, suddenly she remembered that Clara had been made whole again, and that this was the greatest happiness that could be added to all this worldly beauty. Clara had grown quiet. She was quite carried away with delight at the scene before her, and even more at the thought of all that the future held for her, now that she had passed through the remarkable experience of her cure. Her heart was so full that there was hardly room in it for this new happiness, and the sunshine and the sweet odor of the flowers were doing their part in giving her an overpowering sense of joy. So she was speechless. Nor was Peter inclined to talk. In the midst of this field of flowers, he lay quiet and motionless, half asleep. The wind blew softly and gently from behind the wall of cliffs, and rustled overhead in the bushes. For now and then Heidi would bestir herself and hunt for some new spot, for there always seemed to be a place more beautiful than the last one, where the flowers grew in a thicker tangle, where the air was sweeter as it was stirred about by the breeze, and everywhere she had to settle down for a moment. So the hours fled away. The sun was long past midday when a company of goats came walking most seriously up the flowery slope. It was not their usual pasturage ground. They were never brought to it, because they did not care to graze on the flowers. Their troop looked more like an embassy, with Distelfink at its head. The goats had apparently come in search of their companions, who had neglected them so long, and against all the rules of the game, had stayed by themselves so completely. For you see, the goats knew very well what the time of day was. The moment Distelfink discovered the whereabouts of the 3 deserters, he set up a loud bleating, and the others joined in at once in the chorus, and trotted along, making an awful hubbub. That woke Peter from his dreams, but he had to rub his eyes hard to find out where he was, for in his dream the wheelchair had again been standing before the hut, upholstered in red and uninjured. And even now, when he was wide awake, he could still see in the sunshine the gleam of the gilt nails around the cushions. But these he soon discovered to be only the glittering yellow flowers in the ground about him. At that moment there came back to Peter the fear, which he had quite forgotten, when in his dreams he had again seen the uninjured chair. Even though Heidi had promised not to do anything about it, still Peter was greatly afraid that he would not escape from the consequences of his sin so easily. He was entirely tamed, and willing to be a guide or anything else, and did exactly what Heidi asked him to. When, therefore, all 3 had come back to the pasturage, Heidi quickly fetched her dinner bag full of provisions, and set about making good her promise. For although Mr. Peter did not know it, her threat a while before had been that if he was not nice, he could not share their food with the girls. Heidi had noticed especially that morning what goodies grandfather had packed in the bag, and she had been looking forward happily to having Peter share a generous portion of them. But when the boy had been so stubborn, she had been quick to warn him he might not get any dinner, only Peter had not understood her hint, because of his uneasy conscience. Now Heidi was taking piece after piece out of the bag, and stacking the food in 3 small heaps, and these piles gradually grew so tall that she said to herself with satisfaction, "And besides, he can have all the food we leave when we are no longer hungry." Then she presented a little heap to each one, and sat down beside Clara to eat her own portion. And after all the exercise they had had, the children thoroughly enjoyed their hearty meal. It turned out just as Heidi thought it would. After the 2 girls had eaten all they wanted, so much food remained that Peter was given a second pile of it, almost as tall as his first share had been. He ate it all, silently and without pausing for breath, even down to the very crumbs. And yet, as he accomplished this feat, he did not feel any great contentment. There was something within him that gnawed at his stomach, or was it his conscience, so that he fairly choked over every mouthful of food. The children had got to their dinners so late that almost as soon as it was over, grandfather was seen coming up the mountain meadow to get them. Heidi rushed to meet him. She wanted to be the first to tell him what had happened, but she got so excited trying to tell him the wonderful news that she could hardly put her thoughts into words, and yet he seemed to understand at once what she was striving to say, and his face grew bright with joy. He hastened his steps, and when he reached Clara, he said with a happy smile, "So we got up our courage after all, and we won out, didn't we? That's fine." Then he raised Clara from the ground, put his left arm around her waist, and gave her his right hand to take and lean on. And with grandfather's arm like a stout wall at her back, she struck out with her feet more surely and with less fear than before. Heidi hopped along beside her and crowed with glee, and Grandfather looked as if he had met with an unexpected piece of great good fortune. But all at once he lifted Clara into his arms and said warningly, "We must be careful not to overdo it, and besides, it's time to be going back." With that, he started on his way immediately, for he knew that Clara had had exercise enough for one day and was in need of rest. Late that evening, when Peter and his goats came into the hamlet, a large number of people were standing together in a crowd and shoving each other aside so as to get a better view of something that lay on the ground in their midst. Peter went up to have a look too. He pushed and nudged his way right and left, and finally managed to slip through. Then he saw what it was. On the grass lay the middle part of the wheelchair, and a piece of the back was still clinging to it. The red cushions and the shining nails showed how splendid the chair had been before it came to ruin.
"I was here when they were carrying it up," the baker said at Peter's side. "I'll bet anybody it was worth at least 500 francs, but it beats me how it ever got smashed so."
"Nuncle himself said the wind probably blew it down," remarked Barbel, as she studied the red upholstery with a hungry gaze.
"It's a blessing that nobody else broke it," the baker went on to say. "He'd be in an awful hole. If the gentleman in Frankfurt hears about the accident, he'll get the police to find out how it happened. You bet I'm glad I haven't been up on the mountain meadow for 2 years. Anybody may be suspected who is up that way about the right time."
A good many other people said what they thought. But Peter had heard all he could stand. He crept away from the crowd as quietly and meekly as he could, and a moment later he was tearing at top speed up the mountain, as if the evil one were right at his heels. The baker's words had given him an awful scare, for now he realized that at any moment a policeman might come from Frankfurt to spy into the matter, and then it would come out that he was the guilty one, and they would seize him and carry him off to prison. Peter saw all this happening as in a vision, and he grew so frightened that his hair stood on end. He reached home in a state of despair. He would not answer when he was spoken to, and refused to eat his potatoes. As soon as he could, he crawled into bed and began to groan. "Peter's been picking sorrel upon the slope and eating it again," his mother said. "It's resting on his stomach, and that's what makes him groan so." "You must give him a little more bread for his lunch," Grandmother added. "Then he won't be so hungry. Give him a piece of my bread tomorrow." That night, as the two little girls looked up from their beds at the starlight, Heidi said, "Haven't you been thinking all day, Clara, how fine it is that the dear God doesn't give in, when we prayed to him so terribly hard, and yet when he knows of something better?" "Why do you say that just now?" Clara asked. "Don't you see, dear, in Frankfurt I thought the dear God had not heard my prayers, because I begged so hard to go home right away, and he wouldn't let me. But you know, if I had got my wish and gone straight home, you would never have come to the mountain to visit me, and would not have got well." Clara grew thoughtful as she heard these words. "Why then, Heidi," she said after a while, "we oughtn't to pray for anything at all, because the dear God always has something better in mind for us than what we ask him for." "Oh, Clara, how can you talk that way?" Heidi cried almost angrily. "We must pray to the dear God at all times and about everything, for he wishes to hear us say that we have not forgotten him and owe him whatever good thing we have. And your grandmamma told me that if we forget the dear God, then he puts us out of his mind. But then, you see, if we do not receive what we wish for, we must not stop praying and think the dear God has not heard us. No, we must turn to him and say, 'Now I know, dear God, you have something better in mind for me, and I am thankful that you are so good to me.'" "Where did you hear about all that?" Clara asked. "Grandmamma explained it to me at first, and then things turned out just as she said, and then I knew she was right. But I think, Clara," Heidi went on to say as she sat straight up in bed, that tonight we ought certainly to thank the dear good God, because he has given us the happiness of seeing you walk. You're right, Heidi, and I feel that way too, and I'm glad you reminded me of my duty, for in my joy I had almost forgotten it. Then the children said their prayers, and each in her own way thanked the dear God for sending such a wonderful blessing to Clara after she had been sick such a long time. Next morning, Grandfather said he thought they ought to write Grandmamma and tell her that they had a surprise in store for her when she came to the mountain. But the children had thought out another plan, for they wished to give Grandmamma a great big shock. First, Clara must learn to walk better, so that with Heidi's support she could go quite a little way. But the main thing was not to let Grandmamma have the least suspicion of what was up. They would let Grandfather say how long he thought this would take, and he said he thought a week was plenty of time. So in their next letter to Grandmamma, she was urged to come up to the mountain just a week from that date. But not a word was said about anything unusual. The days that followed were by far the most lovely that Clara had spent on the mountain. Each morning she awoke with a loud voice in her heart, crying joyously, "I am well! I am whole again! I don't have to sit in my wheelchair. I can walk around by myself like other people." Then would follow her exercises in walking, and each day it went a little more easily and a little better, and she could walk greater distances. Her exercise gave her such a splendid appetite that Grandfather had to keep making her thick slices of bread and butter even thicker, and he was glad to see how fast they disappeared. He always brought a large pot of foaming milk along with the sandwiches, and filled one bowl after another for Clara. And so the end of the week came, and with it the day that Grandmamma had set aside for her visit. Chapter 23. Parting is such sweet sorrow. A day before her arrival on the mountain meadow, Grandmamma had sent a letter to say exactly when she was coming. Peter brought this letter with him early next day when he was on his way up to the pasture. Grandfather and the children had already come out of the cottage, and Little Swan and Little Bear were both standing outside with them, shaking their heads happily in the cool morning air, while the children stroked their backs and wished them a pleasant journey up the mountainside. Nuncle stood by in much contentment, studying in turn the fresh faces of the children and his clean and shining goats. Both must have given him pleasure, for he was smiling with satisfaction. And then Peter made his appearance. When he caught sight of the little group, he approached more slowly. He seemed fairly to crawl along as he delivered the letter to Nuncle, but the moment he had surrendered it, he jumped shyly backward, as if something had frightened him, and then he looked quickly around him, as if there was another something behind him to be afraid of. Then he gave a leap, and ran away up the mountain. Heidi had been watching these actions with great surprise. "Grandfather," she said, "what makes Peter act the way Big Turk does when he feels the rod about to strike him? Don't you know, he sheers off with his head and shakes it at everything, and then makes sudden leaps in the air."
"I suppose Peter thinks there's a rod after him too, and he knows he deserves it," Grandfather answered.
It was only the first incline that Peter ran up without stopping for breath. The moment he was out of sight of the people below him, he stood still and turned his head fearfully in every direction. Suddenly he jumped and looked behind him, as much afraid as if someone had just grasped him by the back of the neck. For behind every bush, from every hedgerow, Peter was now expecting to see a policeman from Frankfurt rush out at him. The longer he had this intense fear in his heart, the worse he became. He did not have another moment's peace. And now Heidi had to set the hut to rights, for when Grandmamma came, she must find everything in perfect order. Clara always took such an interest in Heidi's furious housekeeping that it was fun for her just to sit at one side and watch while the work was going on. So the first hours of the morning passed, before the children realized it, and it was soon time for them to look forward to Grandmamma's arrival at any moment. Then the children came out of the house again, but this time all dressed for the occasion, and prepared to welcome their expected guest properly. They sat down on the bench in front of the hut to await her. Grandfather came to join them. He had been off for a walk, and had returned with a great big bouquet of dark blue gentians. And the flowers looked so lovely in the light of the clear morning sun that the children cried out with delight when they saw them. Every now and then Heidi would jump up from the bench to run and see if she could catch sight of Grandmamma's party. But then, there it was, suddenly coming up from below, just as Heidi had pictured it. First came the guide, then the white horse with Grandmamma on it, and last of all the porter, with the high wicker hamper, for you may be sure the old lady would never have started out for the mountain without plenty of wraps to protect her. Nearer and nearer came the procession. At last the top was reached. Grandmamma was looking from her horse down at the children. "Why, what is that? What do I see, Clara? You're not in your chair. Why, how can that be?" she cried out in alarm, and hastily climbed down from her horse. But even before she could get to where the children were standing, she was wringing her hands in the greatest excitement and crying, "Clara, my little Clara girl, is it you? Why, your cheeks are as red and round as apples. Child, I simply don't know you any longer." And then Grandmamma started to rush toward Clara. Heidi slipped unnoticed from her place on the bench. Clara quickly found the support of her shoulders, and together the children wandered away, quite calmly starting to take a short walk. For the first few seconds, Grandmamma stood stock still from sheer fright. She was afraid Heidi was doing something that might have terrible results. And then, what was it that she saw right before her? Clara was moving along erect and sure by Heidi's side, and now they had turned around and were coming back again, both with beaming faces, both with cheeks as red as fire. Then Grandmamma literally plunged forward to meet them. Laughing and weeping in the same breath, she hugged Clara tightly to her. Then she clasped Heidi, and then again Clara. Her happy heart was too full for words. Suddenly her gaze rested on Nuncle, who was standing by the bench and smiling happily as he watched the scene before him. Then Grandmamma took Clara's arm in hers and walked with her to the bench. And all the time she was crying out with joy that the miracle had really happened, and here she was walking along with her healthy child beside her. She stood aside from Clara and stretched out both hands to the waiting old gentleman. "My dear Nuncle, what can we ever do to show how grateful we are? It is your work, every bit, your care and nursing." "Added to the sunshine and the highland air of our Lord God," Nuncle interrupted her with a smile. "Yes, and Schweinli's pure fine milk, too," Clara said in her turn. "Grandmamma, you just ought to see how I can drink goat's milk, and how good it tastes." "I can tell all that by your cheeks, Clara," the old lady said, laughing. "No, sir, no one would ever know my little girl now. You've grown plump and broad as I never even dreamed you could, and you're taller, Clara. My, can it really be true? I simply can't take my eyes off of you. I must send a telegram right away to your father in Paris, begging him to come. I shan't tell him why, for it is to be the biggest joy his life will ever have. My dear Nuncle, how can we have the telegram sent at once? You let the men who brought me depart, didn't you?" "Yes, they have gone," he answered. "But if you are in such a hurry, why not have the goatherd take it down? He has time for anything." Grandmamma insisted on having the telegram sent off at once, for she was not willing to keep this happiness from her son a single day. Then Nuncle went off a short distance, and gave so tremendously shrill a whistle through his fingers that you could hear the high notes coming back from the rocks above. So far away had the sharp sound awakened the echoes. Before very long, Peter was seen running down toward them. He knew that whistle. The poor chap was as white as chalk, for he thought Meadow Uncle was calling him down for his punishment. But all that was given him was a piece of paper, on which Grandmamma had written something, and here was Nuncle explaining to him that he had to carry it down to Durfley right away, and leave it at the post office. He was to say that Nuncle would pay for it himself later, for Peter could not be trusted to remember very many things at the same time. And so the lad went off with the paper in his hand, for the time being very much relieved that Nuncle had not whistled for him to go away to court, and that no policeman had appeared. At last they could sit down in sober quiet together around the table in front of the cottage, and then Grandmamma had to be told from the very beginning how things had come about. First she heard how Grandfather had encouraged Clara to stand on her feet a little each day, and afterward tried to walk. Then she listened to the story of the chair that the wind blew away, just as they were setting out for the upper pasture. Then she learned of Clara's great desire to see the flowers, of her first real walk, and of how one thing had led to another. But it was a long while before the children brought their tale to an end, because every now and then Grandmamma would break out in amazement and exclaim, full of praise and gratitude, again and again, "Can it really be possible? Then it's not just a dream after all? Are we actually all awake and sitting here on the mountain meadow before the hut? And is this girl beside me, this creature with the round, flushed face, the same pale, weak Clara that I used to know?" As for Heidi and Clara, there was no end to their delight, because the surprise which they had so carefully planned had turned out so well that Grandmamma just could not recover from the shock of it. During the last few weeks, however, Mr. Sesamon had been finishing up the business that kept him in Paris, and had likewise been preparing a surprise. Without writing a single word to his mother about it, he took the train one sunny summer morning and travelled straight through to Basel. He left there as soon as he could the next day, for he was growing terribly homesick for his little daughter, from whom he had been separated the whole summer long. And it so came about that he arrived in Ragaz but a few hours after his mother had left to go up to the mountain. The news of her trip to pay a visit to Clara suited his plans exactly. The moment that he could, he set off in a carriage, to be driven to Mayenfeld. But when he learned that there was a carriage road to Durfley, he drove on to that point, because he felt sure that the climb on foot up the mountain slope would be as much as he cared to undertake. Nor was Mr. Sesamon mistaken in this, for the steady climb up the sloping trail seemed very long and tiresome to him. Even after he had been toiling up the steep mountain path for quite a while, there was still no hut of any sort in sight, and yet he knew that he ought to come to Goat Peter's house when he was halfway to the mountain meadow, for he had often heard that this was so. All about him were the footprints of people who had passed that way, and often he came to footpaths that led off in all directions. But the trouble was that Mr. Sesamon was not at all sure that he was on the right road, and he thought perhaps the hut was located on the other side of the mountain. He looked about him to see if he could discover any human being from whom he could ask the way. But on every hand it was still as death. Far and wide there was nothing in sight. There was no sound to be heard. The mountain breeze alone occasionally moved the air. Small insects buzzed in the haze of sunlight. Now and then a bird piped merrily from the branches of a lonely larch tree. Mr. Sesamon halted for a few moments, and bared his hot forehead to the cool highland breeze. Just then, someone came running down from above. It was Peter, with the telegram in his hand. He was not keeping to the worn trail, but rushing straight ahead of him, no matter how steep it was. As soon as the speeding boy came close enough, however, Mr. Sesamon waved to him to stop and come over for a minute. Shy and hesitating, Peter approached, not coming directly toward his questioner, but edging along, as if he could move properly with only one of his feet, and had to drag the other after him.
"Come on, boy. Don't be afraid," Mr. Sesamon said to encourage him.
But his words seemed to have a curious effect on the young mountaineer. He halted for an instant, apparently in doubt as to what course he should pursue, and then again crept slowly toward the trail, but at a snail's pace.
"I only want to know," said Mr. Sesamon, "if this is the way up to the hut, where the old man lives with the child Heidi, and where the people from Frankfurt are."
A hollow groan of awful terror was the sole answer to this simple question. Peter darted away with such tremendous leaps that he went plunging down the steep slope, head over heels, and kept rolling over and over in the most unexpected somersaults. In fact, he acted much as the wheelchair had done in its descent, with the exception that Peter did not come to pieces like the chair. The only thing that suffered was the telegram. This received such harsh treatment that it floated away on the breeze, quite torn to shreds.
"That mountaineer is remarkably bashful," Mr. Sesamon said to himself,
for he thought that the appearance of a stranger was the cause of such odd actions on the part of this simple son of the Alps. After he had spent a few moments more watching Peter's violent descent, Mr. Sesamon continued his weary climb. In spite of all his efforts, Peter was unable to find a spot level enough to let him regain his footing. He rolled on and on as if he were never going to stop, and from time to time he curved about in the air in the strangest fashion imaginable. Such turning and tumbling, however, were by no means the worst that fate had to offer him at this moment. Far more terrible were his inward anguish and fear, now that he knew the policeman from Frankfurt was really on his track. For he never doubted that this stranger who was asking about the Frankfurt people up at Meadownuncle's was a detective in plain clothes. At last, when he had reached the last high bluff above Dörfli, Peter managed to clutch a bush and cling to it long enough to stop his downward progress. He lay still a moment before rising, to collect his thoughts and decide what was the next thing to be done.
"Well, I'll be blessed. Here comes another one," said a voice above Peter. "I wonder who the next victim will be that gets a shove and starts flying downhill like a badly sewn potato sack."
It was the Dörfli baker, who stood there making fun of him. He had climbed to the top of the bluff to get a little cool air after the hot morning's work, and had been quietly watching the goatherd as he came racing down the slope, for all the world like the ill-fated chair. Peter sprang to his feet. Here was a new fright, for it seemed that the baker had already learned the chair had been shoved off by somebody, and so, without once looking behind him, Peter turned around and started to run up the mountain again. What he wanted to do most was to go home and creep into bed, for no one would find him there, and of all the places, that seemed the safest. But he had left his goats up in the pasture, and Nuncle had told him particularly to hurry back, so the herd would not be alone too long without their master, and he was more afraid of Nuncle than of anybody else, and stood in such awe of him that he did not dare disobey his lightest word. So Peter groaned aloud and went limping onward. He had to go back up the mountain, only he could not run any longer, for his terror and the many hard knocks that he had got in his falling were beginning to have their effect. Staggering and limping badly, groaning with pain and fear, he climbed up to the mountain meadow. Mr. Sesamon had reached the halfway hut soon after his meeting with Peter, and from that moment he knew that he was on the right path. He climbed on with renewed courage, and at last, after a long, hard pull of it, he saw his goal before him. There stood the hut on the mountain meadow, and above it waved the dark branches of the old pine trees. The traveler climbed the last part of his way with delight, for he was soon to take his child by surprise. But he had already been seen and recognized by the group of people sitting in front of the cottage, and such a surprise was being prepared for him that he little expected. When he had taken the last step up to the height, 2 figures came toward him from the hut. A tall young girl with light yellow hair and rosy face was leaning for support on little Heidi, whose dark eyes were fairly sparkling with glad excitement. Mr. Sesamon started back in amazement. He stood and gazed at the approaching children with wide, staring eyes. What scenes did memory bring back to his fond heart? Tears suddenly flooded his eyes. Just so had Clara's mother looked as a young girl, clear blonde, and with cheeks slightly tinged with red. Mr. Sesamon could not tell whether he was awake or dreaming. "Papa, don't you know me any longer?" Clara called out to him then, and her face beamed at him joyfully. "Am I so changed?" The father rushed toward his little daughter and folded her tightly in his arms.
"I should say you were changed. Is it possible? Can it be?"
And his heart almost bursting with happiness, the father stepped back a short distance, as if to see whether the vision would remain or vanish wholly from his sight.
"Is it really you after all?"
he had to cry one time after another. He took the child back in his arms, and then he had to look at her all over again to make sure that it was actually his Clara who stood erect before him. At that moment, Grandmamma appeared, for she could not wait any longer to feast her eyes on her son's happy face.
"Well, my dear fellow, why don't you say something?" she called in greeting. "This surprise you've given us is very nice indeed, but what do you think of the one we're giving you?"
And the delighted mother kissed her son with fond affection.
"But now, dear," she said after a moment, "come over yonder with me, and be introduced to our good nuncle, who is the greatest benefactor in the world. Surely and at once. But first we must say how do you do to little Heidi," Mr. Sesamon remarked, and he shook hands with the young Swiss girl. "How are you, Heidi? Fresh and blooming as usual up here on your mountain. But my, I don't need to ask, do I? No Alpine rose could look more flourishing. And that's a great joy to me, child, to see you so again."
Heidi looked up with shining eyes at her nice Mr. Sesamon. How good he had always been to her. And it made Heidi's heart beat faster to think that he should be finding such great happiness up here on the mountain meadow. Then Grandmamma led her son over to Meadow Nuncle, and the 2 men shook hands most heartily. Mr. Sesamon insisted on expressing his grateful thanks for the wonderful change in Clara, and said he was utterly amazed that such a thing could ever have happened. But when her son began his speech, Grandmamma stole away, for in this matter she had already said everything that there was to say, and she thought she would like to have a look at the trees. But here was another surprise waiting for her. Under the pines, where the long branches had left a free space, an enormous bunch of wonderful dark blue gentians was standing, and they were just as fresh, as sparkling with dew, as if they had just grown there. Grandmamma clasped her hands in delight. "Why, how perfectly wonderful! How exquisite! What a lovely sight!" she cried. "Heidi, Heidi dear, come here. Did you gather these for me? I never saw anything so splendid." The children joined her in a flash. "Oh, no, I really didn't," Heidi answered, "but I can guess who it was that picked them." "That's the way they are up in the pasture, Grandmamma, only more beautiful still," Clara chimed in. "But only guess who it was that fetched you these flowers early this morning, all the way down from the highland pasture." And Clara smiled so mysteriously at her grandmother that for one mad moment the old lady thought from what the child had said that she had been up there herself that day. But then Grandmamma realized how impossible this would have been. A soft voice was heard to come from behind the fir trees. It was Peter who had now returned. But when he saw who was standing with Nuncle in front of the cottage, he made a big circle around the lawn and was trying to creep quite stealthily behind the pines. But Grandmamma recognized his figure at once, and a new idea came to her mind. Had Peter been the one to gather the flowers for her? And was he now stealing away secretly because he was too shy and modest to want to be thanked for his pretty gift? Oh, no, they could not let such a thing happen. The nice boy must have his reward. "Come here, my lad, and don't be the least afraid," she called to him loudly, and she thrust her head a little way in between the trees. Peter came to a halt, stiff with fear. After all that he had recently suffered, he no longer had strength to fight. There was only one thought in his mind. "It's all up with me now." His hair stood on end, and his pale face was distorted into an expression of great anguish. "Come right here, and no hanging back, mind," Grandmamma said encouragingly. "Now tell me, sir, did you bring me these flowers?" Peter never lifted his eyes to see what the old lady was pointing at. He only knew that Nuncle was standing over there by the corner of the hut, and had his sharp grey eyes fixed upon him. And right beside Nuncle was the most terrible sight that Peter could imagine. The policeman from Frankfurt. So, shaking in every limb, and in a trembling voice, Peter managed to utter just one sound. "No." "Well," Grandmamma said, "that is surely nothing to be afraid of." "But I'm scared because it's all broken to pieces and it can't ever be mended again," Peter stammered with great difficulty, and his knees knocked together so that he could hardly stand. Grandmamma walked over to the corner of the hut. "Tell me, dear Nuncle," she asked sympathetically, "is there something wrong with this boy's upper story?" "Why, no," Nuncle assured her. "Only this boy is the wind that blew away the wheelchair, and now he's come to get the punishment that he so richly deserves." Grandmamma could not bring herself to believe it, for she thought that Peter did not look at all like a naughty boy, and besides he could have had no reason for destroying the chair which was so necessary to them. But the boy's stammering words had only made Nuncle the more sure of what he had already suspected from the start. Grandfather had not failed to notice the sour looks that Peter had been casting at Clara since the first moment he met her, and there had been plenty of other signs of bitterness the boy felt toward these newcomers on the mountain. Grandfather had been putting one thing and another together in his mind, and so had figured out just how the whole affair had happened. He told all this very clearly to Grandmamma, but at the end of his story, she interrupted him in no little excitement. "1,000 times no! We must not punish this poor chap any further, my dear Nuncle. Let's try and be just. Strange people from Frankfurt break into his life and steal Heidi away from him for weeks at a stretch. So he loses what he loves most, his one great blessing, for Heidi is all that to him. And all the poor lad can do is to sit quietly to one side and wait for her to come. Don't you see, we must not be unreasonable with him. His anger got the better of him, and spurred him on to a revenge which was very silly. But then, we're all very foolish when we get angry." Whereupon Grandmamma marched back to Peter, who was still shaking in his shoes. She sat down on the bench underneath the fir trees and said to him in the nicest way, "Come over here, my lad, for I have something to say to you. Don't shiver and shake any more, but just listen to me as you should. You made the wheelchair fall down the slope because you wanted to smash it. That was a very wicked thing to do, as you know very well. And you realized, too, that you deserved a good caning for your naughty deed. And in order to dodge this punishment, you tried as hard as you could to hide what you had done away from people. Isn't this all true?" "Yes," muttered Peter, and hung his head. "But look here, the boy who commits sin, and then thinks that no one knows about it, is badly mistaken. For the dear God sees and hears everything that goes on. And the moment he sees that a little boy wants to hide his sin, the dear God wakes up the watchman that was put in the boy when he was born, and sleeps in him until the boy has done something wrong. And do you know, Peter, what the small watchman has in his hand?" "What?" asked Peter, interested in spite of himself. "He has a pin, and with this pin the watchman keeps pricking the boy, so that he never has a quiet moment to himself. And with his still small voice, the watchman plagues the boy and keeps telling him to torment him. 'You just wait, it will be found out. You're going to be punished, you are.' And then the boy lives in constant fear and trembling, and he has no more fun, not one bit. Isn't that the way you feel about it, Peter?" Peter nodded sorrowfully, but like a person who knows that he has just heard the truth spoken to him. "And in another way you were mistaken," Grandmamma went on. "See how the wrong that you did turned out to be just the best thing that could have happened to the girl you wanted to harm? Because Clara lost her chair, and yet wished so much to see the beautiful flowers, she tried with might and main to walk, and she learned to use her feet and keeps on improving. And if she stays here, she will finally be able to walk up to the pasture every day, much oftener than she could ever have been carried up in her chair. Don't you see how it is, Peter? When a boy wants to do something bad, the dear God can take his act quickly into his own hands and make a blessing out of it. And the wicked boy has had all his trouble for nothing, and the only one he hurts is himself, isn't it?" "Yes," said Peter, for he knew that was true. "Are you sure you have understood me, Peter? Yes? Well, then you just think it over. And every time you want to do something naughty, remember the little watchman inside of you and the pin he carries and his croaking voice, will you?" "Of course I will," Peter answered. But he was still feeling very down in the mouth, because he didn't know how things were going to turn out with the policeman standing over there by Nuncle. "Well, that is good, and then the matter is all settled," Grandmamma concluded. "But now you must have something very nice to make you remember the Frankfurt people. Tell me, dear boy, is there anything that you've always been wishing to have? Tell me the one thing you like best in all the world." Then Peter raised his head and stared at Grandmamma in astonishment. His eyes were as round as marbles. Here he had been expecting something awful to happen, and now there was talking about giving him what he wanted most. That young mind of Peter's was certainly getting all mixed up. "Oh, yes, dear, I mean it," Grandmamma said. "You're to have a nice present, to make you think of the people from Frankfurt, and to show that they have forgotten all about that naughty thing you did. Don't you understand, laddie?" It began to dawn on Peter that he no longer needed to be afraid of punishment, and that the kind lady who sat before him had saved him from the policeman. And then he suddenly felt as light and happy as if a mountain that had been resting on his chest had suddenly fallen off. And he was coming to see that it was better to tell your faults without delay, so he said, And I lost the paper, too." Grandmamma had to think for a while before she got the connection of ideas. But then she remembered, and she said kindly, "I'm glad you told me about it. Always tell what is wrong immediately, and then it can be straightened out. And now, tell me, what is it that you would most wish to have?" Now Peter could choose anything in the wide world that he wanted to own. It made him dizzy just to think of it. The whole fair at Mayenfeld danced before his mind, and he thought of all the pretty wares in the booths at which he had looked for hours, but which he had never hoped to have. For Peter's whole wealth consisted of 5 pennies, and the tempting wares at the fair had always cost at least twice as much as that. He thought of the fine red whistles that would be just the thing to call his goats with. He thought of those fascinating knives with round handles that they called toad-stabbers. Oh, those would make quick work of a hedge of hazel rods. Peter stood there deep in thought. He was trying to decide which of these 2 things was the most desirable, and he could not make up his mind. Then suddenly he had a happy thought. He had found a way by which he might have until the next fair to settle the matter. 10 pennies! Peter said very firmly. Grandmamma could not keep from laughing. At least that is not extravagant, she said. Come to me. She took her purse out of her pocket and drew from it a bright new gold piece. On this she laid 2 10-penny pieces. There, she continued, and now we'll do a little example in arithmetic. Let me show you. In this sum of money, 1 gold piece and 2 10-penny pieces, you have just as many different 10 pennies as there are weeks in a year. So you see, every Sunday you can take 10 pennies to spend, and the money will last a year. Every year of my life? Peter asked innocently. At that, Grandmamma went off into such a gale of laughter that the men over by the corner of the hut stopped their talk to hear what was going on. Before she could continue her dealings with Peter, however, the old lady indulged in another fit of laughing. "Ha! Yes, my boy, every year of your life. I'll put it in my will, do you hear? And when I come to die, there in the will the words will be, 'To Goat Peter, 10 pennies a week as long as he lives.'" Mr. Sesamon nodded, to show that he agreed with Grandmamma, and smiled over at them. Peter cast just one more look at the present in his hand to see if it was really still there, and then he said, "Thank God!" And off he ran, taking unbelievably long leaps, but this time he stayed on his feet instead of turning somersaults, for he was not now driven by fear, but by such joy as he had never before known in his life. All his cares and his anguish had vanished, for was he not to have 10 pennies a week, so long as he should live? Later on, when the little company in front of the hut on the mountain meadow had finished their jolly dinner, and were still sitting together, talking of all sorts of things, Clara took her father's hand in hers. His face still shone with the joy he felt, and each time he looked at her, he seemed, if anything, a little more happy than before. And his daughter said to him in such a lively manner, not at all like that of the limp Clara of other days, "Oh, Papa, if you only knew all that Grandfather has done for me. He's been so good every single day that I can't even begin to tell you all about it. But I'll never forget as long as I live. And I shall always wish that I could do something in return for his loving care, or give him something that would make him at least half as happy as he has made me."
"And that's just exactly the way I feel, my dear child," said her father. "I've been trying right along to think of some way in which we can show a small part of our gratitude to this Prince of all good men."
Then Mr. Sesamon got to his feet and walked over to Nuncle, who was sitting beside Grandmamma, and having the finest kind of a chat with her. The old man rose politely at his guest's approach. Mr. Sesamon grasped him by the hand, and said in the friendliest manner,
"My dear friend, let's have a word together. You will understand me when I say that for many long years I have had no real joy. What did I care for all my money and possessions when I looked at my poor child, whom all my riches could not restore to health? Next to our God in heaven, you have made my daughter whole, and have given me a new life as well. Now tell me how best we can show our deep thankfulness. I can never hope to repay what you have done for me and mine, but whatever is in my power to do, that shall be done. Speak, my friend, what shall it be?"
Nuncle had listened quietly, and had gazed at the happy father with a smile of pleasure. When the other had finished speaking, he said in his decided way,
"Mr. Sesamon, you will believe me when I say that I too have had a large share of joy in this recovery on our meadow. My trouble has already been richly rewarded. Many thanks, my dear sir, for your generous offer, but I am in need of nothing. I shall have my child with me as long as I live, and I have enough for both of us. But there is one wish which I should like to have granted, and then I should never have any further anxiety." "Just name it, my dear friend," Mr. Sesamon urged. "I am old," Nuncle went on to say, "and my days on this earth are numbered. When I pass away I cannot leave the child anything, and she has no relative except a single one, who might take advantage of her innocence. If you feel you can give me the assurance that Heidi will never in her life be compelled to go among strangers to earn her daily bread, then you will have more than repaid me for the little I have done for you and your child." "But, my dear friend, that goes absolutely without saying," Mr. Sessman burst out. "The child belongs to us. Ask my mother or my daughter if Heidi shall be given to other people than to ourselves. But now, dear chap, if it will be the slightest comfort to you, why, there's my hand on it. I promise you solemnly that this child shall never in her life earn her bread among strangers. I'll see to it, even after my life is ended, through my will." "You are a good man," Grandfather said, and for a moment he covered his eyes with his hand. "Nonsense, I will say even more. Heidi is not made to live happily in a strange country no matter how things turn out. We discovered that fact in Frankfurt. But she has made friends. One of them I know in my own hometown. He is settling up his affairs there so that after a little while he can go wherever he likes and have a good rest. I speak, of course, of our friend the doctor. He is coming up here this autumn to ask your advice about where he should locate in this region, for he has enjoyed your company and Heidi's more than anyone else's. So you see, Heidi is going from now on to have 2 guardians near her, and may they both be preserved to her for a long time yet to come." "God grant it," said Grandmamma piously, and as if to say amen to her son's statement, she shook Nuncle's hand very cordially, and for a long time. Then, as she saw Heidi standing close beside her, she suddenly put her arms around the child's neck and drew her toward her. "And you, dear Heidi, must be questioned too, just a little bit. Come and tell me, isn't there some wish that you would like to have granted?" "Oh, of course there is," the little girl answered, and looked delightedly up at Grandmamma. "That's very nice, so out with it," the old lady said encouragingly. "What would you like to have, child?" "I'd like awfully well to have my bed from Frankfurt with the 3 thick pillows and the heavy quilt. And then Grandmother would not have to lie with her head downhill and almost not breathe at all. And she'd be warm as toast under that quilt and wouldn't always have to take her shawl to bed to keep from freezing." In her eagerness to get what she was after, Heidi had said all that in a single breath. "Why, what are you telling me now?" Grandmamma cried excitedly. "It's a good thing you reminded me. In our selfish joy, it is so easy to forget the things we ought to think of first. When the dear God sends us a wondrous blessing, then we should at once think of the poor people less fortunate than we. We'll telegraph straight off to Frankfurt. This very day Rottenmeier will be told to pack the bed, and in 2 days it will be here. If God wills, Grandmother's going to have a fine rest in it." Heidi danced merrily in a circle around Grandmamma, but all at once she paused and said hastily, "Now I'll surely have to race right down to Grandmother's. She'll be worrying because I haven't been to see her for ever so long." For Heidi was on pins and needles. She just could not wait another minute to carry the joyful news to the bedridden old lady, and she remembered how sad Grandmother had been the last time she had been to see her. "No, Heidi, what are you thinking of?" said her grandfather in stern reproof. "When one has guests, one certainly does not go running off like that." But Grandmamma stood firmly by Heidi. "My dear Nuncle, excuse me, but I think the child is right," she said. "Poor Grandmother has for a long time been a loser because of us. Why shouldn't we all of us go right down to see her? I can wait for my horse at Goat Peter's just as well as here. And when it comes we can continue on our way and send the telegram from Dörfli. Son, what do you say to this plan?" Until this moment, Mr. Sessman had had no time to speak of what he intended to do. So he had to ask his mother to wait just a little while if she would, so he could talk his plans over with her. It seems that Mr. Sessman had made up his mind to take a short trip through Switzerland with his mother, and first of all he had wished to see if Clara was in a condition to go a short distance with them. But now there was no reason why he could not take the most enjoyable sort of journey with his little daughter,
and he was very anxious to make use of these lovely late summer days, while they lasted. He thought it best, therefore, to spend the night in Durfey, and next morning to come up to the mountain meadow to get Clara. Then they too would go down and meet Grandmamma in Ragaz, and from there they could travel wherever they wished. Clara was a little taken aback when told to say good-bye to the mountain at such short notice, but there were many other things to be happy about, and besides, there was not any time to waste in being miserable. Grandmamma had already risen and taken Heidi's hand to lead the procession down to Goat Peter's. But then she suddenly remembered. "Why, what in the world are we going to do with Clara?" she cried in much concern, for it occurred to her that the walk would be much too long for the little girl. She found that Nuncle had already taken the child up in his arms, just as he usually did, and was following with sure tread in the footsteps of Heidi and herself. She nodded back at him with great satisfaction. Mr. Sesamon closed up the rear, and so the little company started on its way. Heidi could not keep from dancing with joy by Grandmamma's side, and telling her all she wanted to hear about Peter's old grandmother. She told her of the life in the halfway hut, of all they did there, and of how dreadfully cold it was in the winter. Heidi reported everything down to the smallest detail, for she knew just how they got along, and she drew a clear word picture of Grandmother in her corner, as she sat all bent over and shivering with the cold. She knew everything they had to eat, and all the things they had to go without, too. Grandmamma listened with the keenest sympathy to Heidi's chatter until they came to the hut. Brigitte was just in the act of hanging Peter's second shirt out in the sun, so that it would be ready for him to change into when his other one had been worn long enough. She saw the procession approaching and dived quickly into the living room. "Now they are all going away, Mother," she reported. "It's quite a company of them. Nuncle is with them, too. He's carrying the sick child."
"Oh, isn't there any other way?" Grandmother sighed. "Did you notice if they're taking Heidi along? If the child would only stop in for a moment, just long enough to take my hand in hers. I wish I could hear her voice just once again." Then the door was suddenly flung back, as if a high wind had struck, and Heidi came jumping over to the corner where Grandmother was, and clung to her almost fiercely. "Grandmother, Grandmother, you can never guess. My bed's coming from Frankfurt, and all 3 of the pillows, and the thick quilt, too. It will be here day after tomorrow. Grandmamma said so." Heidi couldn't get her message out fast enough to suit her, because she did not want to wait a second to see the old lady's great joy. Grandmother smiled, but she said a trifle sadly, "Oh, what a good woman she must be. I ought to be glad that she is taking you away with her, Heidi. Only I may not live long enough to welcome you back." "What's that? Who has been telling such tales to this nice old grandmother?" asked a friendly voice at this point. Clara's grandmamma had come into the hut and heard what had been said, so she walked over to the blind woman and pressed her hand heartily. "There's no talk of Heidi's going with us," she went on to say. "The child is to stay here and make you happy. We're planning to see Heidi again, of course, but we're coming here to visit her. We shall be up on the mountain meadow every year, for we have the very best of reasons for coming to the spot where the great miracle was done to our child, and offering up our special thanks to the dear God." Then Grandmother's face was lighted up with a real joy, and she pressed good Mrs. Sesamon's hand again and again, for she could not voice her thanks in words. 2 great tears, but not of sadness, found their way slowly down her cheeks. Heidi had seen the glad light that flashed into Grandmother's face, and felt very happy. "Now it's turned out just as we were reading last time, hasn't it, Grandmother?" she said, snuggling close to the blind woman. "Don't you remember about the word wholesome in the hymn book?
And the bed's going to make you wholesome again, isn't it?"
"Oh, yes, Heidi," Grandmother said with deep feeling. "And the dear God is giving me many other things besides healing my body. How can there be such people in the world to go and bother about a poor old thing like me, and to do so much for me? There is nothing that so strengthens one's faith in the good Father in heaven, who remembers the least of his children, as to find that there are people full of kindness and pity for a useless old woman like me."
"My dear grandmother," Mrs. Sesamon here interrupted her, "in the sight of our Father in heaven, we are all poor and needy, and it's equally necessary to us all that he does not forget. And now we have to say good-bye, but only for a few months, and we'll want to look you up the first moment we come back to the mountain next year. We shall never forget you, be sure of that." Then Mrs. Sesamon took the old lady's hand in hers for the last time and gave it a hearty squeeze. But after all, she was not able to tear herself away quite as soon as she expected to, because Grandmother could not stop her flow of gratitude and kept wishing her visitor all the blessings that the dear God had to bestow on herself and all her household. Then Mr. Sesamon went down the valley with his mother, while Nuncle was carrying Clara back home again, and Heidi, without stopping once, danced madly along beside them, for she was so delighted at what the next days were to bring Grandmother that she had to hop a little almost every step she took. Ah, but the next day there were hot tears enough when she and Clara parted. The little guest could not bear to leave her lovely mountain meadow, where she had found the greatest happiness of her life. But Heidi comforted her and said, "It will be next summer again before you know it, and then you'll come again, and it will be nicer than ever, lots nicer. Then you can walk right from the start of your visit, and we'll go up to the pasture with the goats every day, and we'll see the flowers and everything, and it will all be jolly from the word go." Mr. Sesamon came, just as he said he would, to carry off his daughter, and he stood and talked a short while with Grandfather, for the two men found much to say. Clara was wiping away her tears as best she could, and finding much comfort in Heidi's words. "Don't forget to say good-bye to Peter for me," Clara said again, "and tell the goats good-bye, especially Schweinli. I wish I could think of a present to give Schweinli. She helped me such a lot to get well." "You can do that fast enough," Heidi assured her. "Just send her a little salt. Don't you remember how she likes to lick the salt from Grandfather's hand at dusk?" This advice Clara found most pleasing. "Oh, then I'll surely send her 100 pounds of salt from Frankfurt," she cried joyfully. "She must have something to remember me by." Then Mr. Sesamon beckoned to the children, for the time had come to start. Grandmamma's white horse had come for Clara to ride, and so there was no more need for the basket chair. Heidi took up her position at the extreme edge of the slope, and waved her hand to Clara until the last small speck of both horse and rider had disappeared. The bed came safely, and Grandmother sleeps in it so soundly that she is regaining some of her old strength. Kind Grandmamma, when she got back to her home in Holstein, did not forget about the grim winter on the mountain. She sent an enormous package of clothes to the hut of Goat Peter. There were so many warm things packed away in it that Grandmother could wrap herself up until she was almost lost beneath her coverings. And never once again did she have to sit in the corner and shiver with the cold. A great house is being built in the hamlet. The doctor came, and for a short spell went to live in his old lodgings. But on the advice of his friend Meadownunkle, the doctor bought the old building where Heidi had lived the winter before, and which had formerly been a lordly mansion, as could easily be seen from the lofty living room, with the handsome stove and the fine panelling. This part of the old house the doctor is having rebuilt for his own quarters. The other side of the spacious building is being fitted up for the winter home of Nuncle and Heidi, for the doctor realizes that grandfather is an independent sort of man and must have his own house. Back of all of it is a warm goat stable with thick walls, and here Schweinli and Barely can spend their winter days in vast comfort. The doctor and Meadownunkle grow to be better friends every day, and while they are climbing around the walls together, watching the progress of their new building, their thoughts never fail to turn to Heidi. For to both of them, the chief joy in their new house is that they are to move into it with their happy child.
"My dear Nuncle," the doctor said recently as he was standing on the wall with the old gentleman, "you must look at the matter as I do. I share all joys with the child, just as if next to you I were her nearest relative. But I also want to share all the duties that have to do with the care of the child. In that way I can hope to have a claim on Heidi too, and can look forward to her living with me in my old age and caring for me. This is my dearest hope. Heidi shall share in my possessions as if she were my own child, and therefore we can leave her behind us without fear when the time comes for us to go, you and I."
Nuncle pressed the doctor's hand gratefully. He said nothing, for he was a silent sort of man, but his good friend could see in his eyes how deeply Nuncle had been touched, and how happy these words had made him. Meanwhile, Heidi and Peter were sitting with grandmother, and the young girl had to talk so much, and the young lad had to listen so hard, that they almost lost their breath in their excitement, and kept almost stumbling right over the happy old blind lady. And then, too, there was such a lot to tell grandmother about what had happened during the summer, for they had not met very often all that long time. And each of the three looked happier than the other two, because here they were all back together again, and also because such amazing things had happened. But happier than any other face was perhaps that of Mother Brigida, for now with Heidi's help, she had at last got the straight of the story about the 10-penny pieces that were to go on forever. Finally, however, grandmother said, "Heidi, read me a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. I feel as if I could never fail to give praise and glory to our Father in heaven for all the blessings that he has so richly showered upon us." The end. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we begin a new book. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.